Hello and welcome. My name is Ryan Gambarino. This is my presentation, Don't Panic, Conquering Performance Anxiety with Neuroscience. Get this out of the way. So first, a bit about me. My name is Ryan Gambarino, and I am a senior undergraduate here at the University of Florida. I am currently in my final semester pursuing a Bachelor of Music and Saxophone Performance, studying with Dr. Helton, and a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry here in the Chemistry Department at UF. I am currently conducting research in the UF Performance Psychology Lab under PI Dr. Christopher Janelle. Some acknowledgements I'd like to address real quick. First and foremost is Dr. Jonathan Helton for putting on this whole conference and hosting everybody and giving us a really exciting chance to engage in some awesome talks today. Next is Dr. Orr in the University of Florida School of Music for hosting the whole thing. Next, I'd like to thank the UF Performance Psychology Lab and Dr. Christopher Janelle for his mentorship and for some guidance in formulating the survey that makes up a large amount of the data that I'm going to be using in this talk. And of course, the participants that filled out that anonymous survey, I'll be going into that a little bit later. It gave me some really interesting data to work with and some really cool things to inform some of the therapies that I'll talk about. So an overview of what I'll be talking about here today is first up, the origins of performance anxiety, the different nervous systems and neurochemicals that control it, and also where those things came from. How performance anxiety affects us as professional musicians and professional performers. And I'll be using a lot of the survey results that I have for that. Next, the techniques to overcome performance anxiety, where I'll be talking about a couple of theories of stress, some breathing techniques that we can use, and also some drug and environment interactions that really can affect the magnitude that one might experience in performance anxiety. So part of the battle in studying performance anxiety and fitting it into a box that we can all agree upon is the definition of that thing. So by far the best working definition I've come across is from Oxford Languages, which states that performance anxiety is an extreme nervousness experienced before or during participation in an activity taking place in front of an audience. And so performance anxiety also occupies a lot of names. It goes by obviously that, or the human stress response, also the fight or flight response. So you'll hear me use a lot of those words interchangeably in this talk. It's very important to remember that this is a mental and physiological phenomenon. This is something that occurs both in our nervous system and very much relies on our brain's perception of our environment around us. And so for that reason, we're able to measure the human stress response using a couple of different metrics, mainly perceptive self-reporting, which is what I used in the survey that I distributed, and also using some physical measurements that we'll get into just a little bit later. So by far the most important thing to understand about the human stress response and performance anxiety is that it is the physiological act of our body interacting with our environment. And the system that controls all of this is the autonomic nervous system, which is a part of our overall central nervous system. Using a combination of hormones and neuron potentials, this system allows our body to interact with our environment completely unconsciously. So the ANS is actually the division of your body which controls all of your unconscious processes. So if you can think about just throughout your daily life, your pulse, your breathing, any sort of involuntary movement that you might carry out, that is what is the ANS is exactly what controls that. And so as a result, obviously the ANS heavily influences the function of our internal organs. And the onset of the ANS's regulation is what we call the fight or flight response. The ANS can be broken down into two halves. The first half is what is called the sympathetic nervous system. And this is the part of our body that is responsible for priming us for action. So this system actually evolved as a means of protecting an organism from the environmental dangers that our brain detects. And so as soon as your brain detects a threat in your environment, it'll trigger your sympathetic nervous system, and it'll go something like this. Your heart rate will start to increase to allow more blood to circulate glucose throughout your body. Your breath rate will ramp up to increase your brain's oxygen supply. You'll start to perspire, and it'll keep your body cool. Your digestive system will slow, and your eyes will dilate to allow more light into your optic nerve to allow more information to be processed. And so all of these processes are in the interest of survivability, but they are obviously very taxing on our bodies because this sort of heightened state of alertness comes with a big energy cost. So to grapple with that, our bodies also developed what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is responsible for relaxing most of our normal function, or sorry, relaxing the nervous system back to normal function. And so anytime this system is engaged, you'll see slowed heart rate, normalized breath rate, increased salivation, and a return to normal digestion. And so we can kind of think of these two things as two halves of the same coin. So the sympathetic nervous system is what is mainly concerned with allowing us to survive in dangerous environments. And the parasympathetic nervous system is the flip side of that coin, which is concerned with conserving our energy and recognizing that now is the time to go through a rest and digestion process where we return to normal function. And so probably the most important thing to understand from all of this is that while there are many things that control these processes, cortisol is by far the most important. It's a molecule that is actually a hormone that's released in the body, and it signals the onset of the fight or flight response. So it's a steroid that's produced by your adrenal gland above your kidneys, and it's regulated by your hypothalamus in your brain. And so, like I said, this release of cortisol is what marks the onset of the sympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight response. And what's very interesting about cortisol is it actually allows us a physical measurement that we can use to quantify the human stress response. And so what's amazing about this is all of this comes from the nervous system that we as humans live with every single day. The type of nervous system that we have is called a bilateral nervous system, and it started evolving around 550 to 600 million years ago. The stress response, the chemical process that dictates our stress response, started popping up around 530 million years ago in this this creature. It's called actually a sea squirt, but official name Siona intestinalis. It's a very rudimentary organism. It has a very simple central nervous system, but it is actually the one of the first creatures where we can see the genes being coded for our stress response. And so what's important to take away from this is that our stress response has been in development for over 500 million years of evolution. And for the most part, that the intention behind it has been to prioritize our survival in hostile environments. But interestingly enough, we don't have to be in mortal danger to see the effect of these systems. If you've ever woken up and realized that you overslept, or you get to a rehearsal only to realize that it started 30 minutes ago, your experience probably went something like this. You feel your stomach drop, your breathing gets shallow, your heart rate increases and your chest starts pounding, and your palms start sweating. And while this is a human experience that we've all probably had dozens and dozens of times, what it really is a relic of a 500 million year old ritual that's coded into our DNA and has, for the most part, kept us alive through that amount of evolution. And what's crazy is that performance truly is not unique from any of these situations. It's an act that our bodies universally recognize as dangerous and will engage these different systems to protect us against. So being in a room filled with a bunch of people all looking down on you, sort of judging your ability to perform in create a cohesive product such as music, art, and just performance in general is something that our bodies actively recognize as being dangerous. So this is where a lot of our performance anxiety responses originate in our bodies. Next, I'd like to look at sort of the subjective appeal to how performance anxiety affects us. To do this, I conducted a survey leading up to this talk. Throughout the month of February, I collected data through an anonymous survey conducted through Qualtrics, which was distributed through social media. We had 91 respondents, which I was pretty happy with. And we asked all of the participants to self-report different parameters of the anxiety that they experience surrounding performance. So we asked for demographics, things like age, education, symptoms of anxiety, levels of anxiety, and settings of anxiety. And this was intended for all performing artists, not just music. So we have a very holistic approach to this. The first thing that I asked people to do was point out their symptoms. This table shows all of the symptoms that I allowed them to choose from. And it started with rapid pulse and breathing, increasing in intensity all the way down to loss of consciousness. And so in this funnel chart here, we can see the percentages that everybody chose. By far the most common was the rapid pulse and breathing. Next were trembling hands, sweaty or clammy palms, dry mouth, shortness of breath, nausea, impaired vision, all the way down to only 2 respondents giving loss of consciousness. And this is where we can really start to see the unique individual human experience crop up in performance anxiety. Obviously, these are all things that are possible through the human stress response, but this data sort of elucidates how individuals perceive their own stress as being unique from others. And so we can see here that if we go back to our list of processes that the sympathetic nervous system engages in, we can see them sort of align where we have an increased heart rate being prevalent amongst most of the respondents of the survey. Increased breathing, shortness of breath was not quite as likely, but still prevalent. Increased perspiration was extremely prevalent. The alteration of your digestion was very common as well. And overall, we can see just how unique and difficult performance anxiety can be to deal with here. And so this is mainly the data that I use to inform a lot of the therapies that I'll talk about later. In addition to this, we asked respondents to discuss the frequency of their anxiety, ranging from never experiencing performance anxiety all the way down to experiencing performance anxiety every time I perform. And so this really shows that most responses range from the often to every time category. Not a single person answered never, so that's good. At least this is of some use to probably everybody that filled out the survey. The impact of anxiety was also recorded. So this asked respondents to answer the impact that performance anxiety has on the quality of their performance. And this ranged from no impact all the way up to controlling the quality. And this graph centered a little bit more around the middle range here, where it doesn't completely alter the quality of the performance. That obviously has some intrinsic value on it in its own, but there is still some strong impact here from performance anxiety on the quality of an artistic performance. So next, I wanted to use these 2 graphs to show the impact of anxiety as a function of the frequency. So taking the data on the frequency of how people rated their stress response and looking at how that impacted their how that impacted the quality of their performance. And so very interestingly, this follows a perfectly linear trend where the more you experience performance anxiety, the more frequent, the more impact it actually had on the quality of performance based on how people answered these questions. So this kind of shows that there's a positive correlation between frequency and impact. So that sort of twofold shows how the mitigation of this issue can really help. Probably the thing that I was most interested in is studying the magnitude of anxiety in relation to time. So I asked people to rate their magnitude of performance anxiety from none at all to a great deal, sort of how much stress you feel in a certain moment across the experience before a performance, during a performance, and after a performance. And this, I think, is actually extremely interesting because if we take all of the averages here, we can see that unanimously the trend is downward across time. So the most anxiety was actually experienced before the performance. It dropped slightly during the performance and then massively dropped after the performance. And so then I was able to take this data and graph it as a function of amount of time spent studying performance in years. So early in the survey, I asked people to report how many years they had been studying performance, from 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and more than 30. And so based on those responses, we actually are able to see that in all time frames before, during, and after performance, people that had spent the least amount of time studying performance showed the highest magnitude of anxiety. And this followed pretty much a downwards trend over time, except for this very interesting bump here between the 6 to 10 year category and 11 to 20 year. And so the way I actually think of explaining this is that the 11 to 20 year category is usually where we would start to see higher level collegiate training and performance and getting into more professional environments such as master's degrees and straight up professional performance in such as orchestra, professional theater, etc. So this increases here, this sort of bumps up here as a result of the increasing stakes of the environment of the performance. Overall, though, we do see a downwards trend over time. Taking the same data and graphing it as a function of education, though, tells us a very different story. It seems that this has almost no trend to speak of. And so this sort of shows the value in rote time spent engaging in performance rather than necessarily your level of education in performance. And so the final question that I wanted to ask people was the level of anxiety by ensemble size, where I measured solo performance, small group performance, medium group performance, and large group performance. Solo performance would be something like just either you or you and accompaniment. Small group would be somewhere between a duet and a quartet. Medium group would be like a Stravinsky octet we could think of, or like a small band, perhaps. And large group would be any more than 12 performers. So thinking of like orchestras, symphonies, marching bands, etc. And interestingly enough, this followed an exactly linear trend with the size of the ensemble. So relative level of anxiety was taken for solo performance was the highest, and it decreased as the ensemble grew larger. So this sort of shows that the more people that you have engaging in performance anxiety, or sorry, the more people you have engaging in performance, that performance anxiety is mitigated over the group. And based on what you responded to in the survey as being your highest level of anxiety by ensemble size, the survey would then direct you to answer the level of anxiety by audience size for that ensemble. So for example, if you answered solo performance was your most anxious setting, it would then ask you for the audience size in that setting of performance that would produce the highest stress response. And interestingly enough, the size of the audience that created the highest stress response was actually the 1 to 5 category. So despite it being the smallest amount of people, it still produced the highest stress response. And I would argue that that goes to show that the dynamic of your audience really makes a difference. Because if we think about what we would normally be performing to in a 1 to 5 person audience, that's probably somebody that's very close to you, maybe your family, close friends, or professors, for example. And these are all people that have a vested interest in your success. So this sort of shows that the dynamic of the audience and the dynamic of the environment has a very, very large impact. So taking all of that data, I'm going to be talking about now the techniques to overcome performance anxiety that we as performers can use. I'm going to lovingly call this section the neurological hijacking section, because the goal here is to create an environment for your nervous system that emulates a relaxed state. So we're kind of using our many, many years of evolution in neurology to work towards a more amicable environment for us as performers. And so by placing yourself in a relaxed state, your body begins to lessen the threat response in your nervous system. And this ranges anywhere from lowered heart rate to a more ample supply of oxygen through better breathing tendencies and conservative use of motion. So not erratic movement that uses up a lot of your body's energy. And so I want to start this section with something called the theory of optimal arousal. And this is the idea that on either end of the stress spectrum, either being completely relaxed or being completely stressed is very negative for us. If you're completely relaxed, you tend to be aloof, you tend to be disengaged. If you're completely stressed, you're hypertense, you're sort of overworked and overridden. And we want to shoot for this area in the middle of the bell curve that allows us to have the highest quality of performance as a result of our engagement in our activity. And so this is to say that the sensation of stressful arousal is not always a negative thing. Our bodies evolved these systems to deal with a variety of situations, and therefore we can think of these stress responses as not a hurdle to performance, but instead a facet of the preparation to performance. And what I think supports this the most is actually the data from before, where we look at the magnitude of anxiety in relation to time. And we see that before performance, our stress response, our magnitude of anxiety is higher than during the performance. So this is recognizing that once we start engaging in a truly difficult activity, such as music performance or any sort of performative art, our body has to quell that anxious desire, such as hypertense breathing, fast pulse. We have to reduce a lot of that to actually actively engage in what we're doing. So this speaks mostly to the mindset of what we do as performers and how performance anxiety truly is not a negative thing. In some cases, we may perceive it as negative, but if we can remove ourselves from that mindset, we actually see a smaller stress response and therein more likely a higher quality of performance. Some physiological methods of dealing with performance anxiety. One thing I really want to focus on is diaphragmatic breathing. And so this is a method of breathing that claims to alleviate anxiety symptoms. There was a study in 2017 that was conducted that showed a reduction between 20 and 40% of that salivary cortisol level. And we remember that cortisol is the thing that sort of indicates a higher stress response. So if we have lower levels of cortisol, we tend to have a lower stress response. And so diaphragmatic breathing can be practiced by engaging the diaphragm to completely expel air from the lungs. We as musicians, I'm sure, learn a lot about the diaphragm as a muscle in our body. But most of that's in reference to using it to actively engage in playing rather than all other times of performance, whenever we're resting, whenever we're preparing to step out onto stage. Breathing diaphragmatically will allow us to sort of reduce those cortisol levels, put ourselves in a more equitable stress state. And this study also suggests that the optimal rate of breathing to reduce heart rate is around 4.5 to 6.5 breaths per minute. And we can very easily achieve that with diaphragmatic breathing. And so the method of diaphragmatic breathing that I'm going to teach today is the 4-7-8 method. And this goes by 4 counts of an inhale, 7 counts of holding your breath, and then 8 counts of an exhale. And so what this really does for us is allows a surplus of oxygen to enter our lungs. Those 4 counts of inhale gets a large reservoir of oxygen to enter. 7 counts of holding the breath allows our bloodstream to absorb most of that oxygen and get it to our brain. And then the 8 counts of exhale is probably the most important part, where it evacuates our lungs entirely of that stale air and allows new fresh air to come in and replenish. And so this is the exhale is by far the most important part, because when we're anxious, we tend to breathe very shallowly, which sort of allows us to build up stale air. And something I would recommend for this is placing a hand on your chest and a hand on your stomach, and then practicing the inhaling method. And what should happen is your chest should stay steady while your stomach rises, and this ensures that all of the action is performed entirely by your diaphragm. So next, I want to go over some of the drug and environment interactions that happen with our bodies in certain situations, certain stressful situations. We sadly cannot really control the nervous systems that we as humans and performers have, but we can control all of the things that we put into our body. And so the biggest thing that I want to go over, and this hurts me in particular because I live and breathe this stuff, is caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant that's found in most drinks, such as coffee and tea. And it's one of the most commonly consumed chemicals in the world, and it actually has a very strong impact on our stress response. So a 2006 study showed the correlation between caffeine consumption and cortisol trends during stressful experiences. And this was done by dosing participants with 250 milligrams of caffeine 3 times a day, and then measuring cortisol concentrations throughout the day. And these were all done after different periods of stress, caffeine consumption, and food intake. And in case you were wondering, 250 milligram dose of caffeine, based on Starbucks' self-reporting, a tall Verona is around 260 milligrams. So this is about one Starbucks coffee worth of caffeine. And so this study showed the cortisol levels between men and women in both mental stress environments and exercise environments. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to be focusing on the mental stress environments. So here we record a baseline saliva cortisol concentration, and then the participants received either caffeine or a placebo. And so the caffeine line shows the cortisol concentration, or sorry, the solid line shows cortisol concentration in the caffeine group, dotted line for the placebo group. And the stress was emulated by requiring participants to perform a reactionary test and an arithmetic test. And here we can see a very extreme jump after the period of stress in the caffeine group in cortisol levels, but not so much in the placebo group. And so what this really states is that caffeine prior to a performative stress experience can actually have a very strong impact on how we as performers react to that stress, that external stress. And so while I'm not saying to completely rid ourselves of caffeine, I would highly recommend maybe dosing caffeine a bit before a performance rather than, or quite a while before performance rather than drinking it right before. I used to have a really a really bad ritual where I would have a coffee right before going on stage. And over the years, I've realized that, especially after this study, that's probably not a very good thing to do. One thing that's interesting to note here is the caffeine intake right here during the post-meal period, and then the measurement here. We can see that cortisol levels go up in the caffeine group, but decline in the placebo group. And this goes back to our parasympathetic nervous system idea, where digestion is aided by lowered cortisol levels. So, and it actually is going in the opposite direction in the caffeine group. And so the final thing I want to hit on here is environmental factors of stress. And I want to talk about the concept of fair treatment. And this is in particular talking to appealing to our role as educators and mentors in this field. An early study in 1984 found that the stress of a situation is positively correlated with the difficulty of the task. but the external interaction after that stressful experience impacts the individual's response as well. And so participants were given the same test, one in a stressful environment and one in a not stressful environment. And afterwards, they were told that their performance was disappointing. But one group was given a fair outlet to express their sort of disdain for the test. They were given an outlet to make excuses or say why they didn't necessarily perform as well as they wanted to. Whereas another group was not given that opportunity at all. And so what this study showed is that the treatment that individuals undergo after a stressful experience has a positive reduction to that stressful experience. Afterwards, this study was emulated, but comparing type A and type B personalities. And this yielded some very, very interesting results, showing that type A personalities respond to stressful situations much faster than type B personalities do. And type B personalities show a much slower stress response than their type A counterparts. And so what I think this really shows is that while anxiety is a broad and ever-pervasive factor of our existence as human beings, we as humans and performance artists will never entirely escape or overcome it, but we can instead strive to make our neurology work more efficiently for us. And we as performers, educators, and mentors can create lifestyles and environments that have a unanimously positive effect on something that we all have to deal with. All of the things that I've talked about today are techniques and environments that we can employ as musicians, performers, and overall just as human beings living in a constantly stressful and difficult to deal with society in order to make a more prolific performance practice. And I will be happy to field any questions that the audience might have now. Here are my citations in case you are interested, some of the works that I referenced within this talk. If anybody has any questions, I am happy to field them right now. So yes, I actually I did. There's a lot of very interesting but very conflicting work going on with pre-performance foods and dietary environments in general. Oh, sorry. I received a private chat asking if I looked into pre-performance foods that optimize reduction of performance anxiety. And so I did. I wanted to include it in this talk, but I went a little bit over time as is. I didn't get a chance. Interestingly enough, the studies that I found cited that a high carbohydrate, medium protein diet had a positive effect on cortisol concentrations, and actually a diet high in protein content had a really negative stress response correlated with it, especially in men. Actually, women seem to not respond to it quite as much, but men really, with high protein diets, exhibited a much higher cortisol response to stressful situations. Thank you so much, Teresa. I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. Is it possible to get a PDF of the presentation? Yeah, I will. I will send that to Dr. Helton. He should be putting all of this stuff up next week, and hopefully I can get that PDF of the presentation attached to the recording. Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for joining me. If there are any final questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, oh, Laura, I am a certified aromatherapist. I researched how essential oils can help this. Did you find any information about these, in particular peppermint and sweet orange? I did look into a lot of meditative studies where sort of in tandem with the diaphragmatic breathing environments, like with aromatherapy and sort of calming sounds, were used to reduce the stress response. I didn't find any correlations with particular aromas. It did seem, though, I saw one report that said more subtle aromas, things that aren't as abrasive as just really arid, acrid smells that you would get distracted by are most useful. So I would imagine that light amounts of peppermint or sweet orange would really help that. Yeah. Thank you so much, Teresa. Thank you everybody for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you to the rest of the people that presented today and the ones that will go after me.